and welcome to my video. My name is Amanda, and today I would like to talk about the language of disability to help you explore and discover what naming system is appropriate for you. This video is intended to give people some sort of clarity that can be used when referring to disability in social conversations, papers, or when creating policy. This video will have 3 distinct sections. Why is language important? What type of language exists? And which language should I choose to use? I have used a variety of articles and books to ground my discussion today. I will include a list of materials used at the end of this video if you're interested in further reading. Throughout the video, I will also be putting relevant authors and their work in the corner of the board for reference. If I include quotation marks, it means it's a direct quote. Something important to note before we start. We will not be talking about which groups of people are classified as disabled and what the category represents. This is a different topic entirely. If that's what you're looking for, considering looking into the social model, the minority model, or the medical model to start. With all of that out of the way, let's get started. Why is language surrounding disability something that people struggle with? Often when talking about this category, you may hear common phrases like, "I would never see you as disabled." "Are you really offended by the term idiot?" "Is it okay for me to call you disabled?" These common questions and interactions between people signify the awkwardness and unawareness surrounding language associated with disability. Why is this something that we struggle with? As Margaret Price points out in her work, Mental Disability and Other Terms of Art, it cannot be because of the lack of words in our vocabulary, and it cannot be because of the lack of commonality of people with disabilities. In fact, disability touches everyone, or at least has the ability to. According to the Canadian government, over 4 million Canadians have reported some level of disability. Language plays a larger role than people might think. As it is something we use in our daily lives, it can often go unnoticed, uncriticized, and unquestioned. What is the larger impact of language, and what kind of role does it play? Language plays a strong role in power dynamics between different groups. Language is one of the mechanisms by which dominant groups keep others in place. Having a term associated with belittling and diminishing others allows the dominant group to maintain and perpetuate their power. Commonly referring to groups of people in such a way will further entrench their appearance and perception as smaller and lesser people. It is not hard to find instances in history where language has been used to perpetuate a power dynamic between two groups. Some common examples are queer for the LGBTQ+ community and Indian for indigenous groups. When trying to gain more control over their lives, minority groups target the issue of naming as their first battleground. Language also plays a role in the political and social atmosphere. To address this role, we will look at a term, apparatus of disability, proposed by Shelley Tremaine. She proposed this idea to signify that disability cannot be pinned to one thing, but is a combination of many things. You cannot say disability is just the state of your body, or if you are allowed to park in a stall closer to a door. You cannot say disability is when you receive money from the government, or if you require an EA at school. Disability is comprised of all these examples and so many more. It is compiled of laws, procedures, traditions, and administrative measures altogether. Looking at them individually and defining them as disability wouldn't fit correctly. It instead becomes an apparatus. If this is confusing to think about, a good example to relate it to is marriage. Marriage can also be described as an apparatus because it is not simply a relationship between two people. Marriage is a contract between people, but is also something that appears in the tax code. There are also traditions surrounding marriage, like white dresses and throwing the bouquet. Both elements of disability in marriage are developed abstractly and cannot be boiled down to one thing. Instead, we have to deal with these topics as apparatuses. The creation of these apparatuses is developed through political, historical, social, and religious pressures. How does this relate to language? Well, language surrounding disability is part of the apparatus. The way we name and define people contributes to the way ideas of disability are enforced. This perpetual reinforcement of ideas shapes the way society views disability and the way in which we respond to it. Just as disability is not apolitical or ahistorical, our language surrounding it isn't either. As Leisha Carlson mentions in her book, The Faces of Intellectual Disability, the fact that philosophers are uncritically and perhaps unconsciously speaking this language indicates that they are either unaware of or unwilling to acknowledge the historical weight of the words they choose. There is no reason to think that the weight of these terms and their impact are any less heavy for those to whom they refer. The same thing can be applied for any person. We have an epistemic responsibility as members of our communities and society to understand the impact of our words. Having the correct term that conveys the information we want to bring forward will only increase the effectiveness of your argument or information. Again, as Carlson states, not taking naming seriously only shrinks one's epistemic responsibility to both the reader and the subject, since carelessness in terminology can paint a distorted picture for the reader. Now understanding the influential role language plays in defining and shaping disability, what are different terms and labels that currently exist? In efforts to use the correct language, it may be a common idea to look at what the government and other policymakers use and follow their naming schemes. These policies are often viewed as objective or neutral sources of information, which is why many people would seek their guidance to answering the question of naming. For example, Statistic Canada opts for the terms person with disabilities in their reports. Should the term person with disabilities be the language we adopt? As Price points out, setting policy or policymakers up as objective or neutral scientific discourse provides an argument for its stance, while also insulates itself against the possibility of alternative arguments. This all-seeing, all-knowing view has been criticized by many philosophers. The concept that the identity of a knower is irrelevant because knowledge is impartial has been described by Thomas Nagel as the view from nowhere and Donna Haraway as God trick. People are not concerned with who wrote the policy and what their epistemic position is. Instead, we view these policies as all-knowing and rule of law. A way to picture this is as disembodied brains. It doesn't matter who is attached to their brain or what their identity is. We pay attention only to their knowledge and accept it as fact. This certainly is not the case for these policies. Each and every one of them was written by someone with a certain standpoint and epistemic location. Each of these people have their own biases, viewpoints, and perspectives. Because of this, we cannot say that their work is in fact rule of law or all-knowing. Furthermore, the naming that is reflected in policies normally is not derived from policy itself, but came from language that is already floating around in society. So where do different naming conventions come from? What is the history of these words and the implication created from using them? To address these questions, I'm going to talk about two different subcategories: intellectual disability and physical disability. It is not uncommon to hear words like idiot, moron, and fool in informal conversations between people. Each of these words has served as an actual classification and scientific diagnosis of people with intellectual disabilities. To fully understand this historical context of these terms, I will provide you with a picture of the social atmosphere in 19th century America. At this time, institutions were being created for feeble-minded individuals. They were developed with the motivation that idiots needed to be protected from society, and society needed to be protected from them. The goal of these institutions was to educate children to the best of their ability, considering the mental conditions they were working with. These children were also subjected to manual labor, again, depending on their capacity to be educated. As Carlson notes, within the complex institutional world, intellectual disability was both found and made. Knowledge was remade and reported. Patterns were recognized, inverted, and imposed. People who were placed in these institutions were associated with the term idiots as their diagnosis and scientific classification. People who suffered from idiocy have been viewed as objects of pity, decomposed and diseased organisms. The word itself dates back to the 14th century, but in the 19th to 20th century, the word took a new form, focusing on the lack of something, a deviation away from the normal. Idiocy became the general term for all forms of mental deficiency, as well as subclassifications of people. Essentially, if you had any quality that didn't match a normal brain, then you would be deemed an idiot and guided into institutionalization. Idiots were not something to be celebrated, but instead an undesired quality that indicated you had a lower level of development. In fact, the lowest level of development potential for a human being. The true mindset, attitude, and view towards people with this quality is expressed well in Edward Seguin's words. The idiot moves, feels, understands, wills, but imperfectly. Does nothing, thinks nothing, cares for nothing. Moreover, the depiction of idiots was often animal-like and subhuman. Eventually, after idiots inside of institutions were studied and observed more carefully, the classification of idiot was broken up multiple times. Samuel Gridley Howe was the first person to divide idiocy into categories. He determines there are 3 types of intellectually disabled people: idiots, fools, which are a higher class of idiot, and simpletons, which are the highest class of idiot. After Howe's division, H. Goodard also created class distinctions inside of the intellectually disabled community. He split people up into idiots, imbeciles, which were a higher class of idiot, and morons. Morons were considered the most dangerous type of person because they were the least apparent in society. Without the use of mental testing, they would be able to go unnoticed in the world. Goodard believed that morons had a direct link with criminality, which promoted further steps in trying to eliminate the moron from society. This could include segregation and sterilization as a means of controlling the spread of morons. Ultimately, because morons can exist freely in the world without detection, they were at the highest risk of reproduction. If morons were to reproduce, they would be passing on their taint of bad blood and creating more criminals in the world. These words associated with intellectual disability today represent specific views, stereotypes, and perspectives that existed for idiots at that time. This can also be said for physical disability. Words such as cripple and handicap also have histories and connotations associated with them. Cripple was defined as a lame or partially disabled person or animal with something flawed or imperfect. Similar to idiot, it was used to describe a whole classification of people with specific attention to a deviation away from the normal. The word itself can be traced back to Old English, where it was used as a synonym to bent over or creep. Handicap is defined as a condition that restricts a person's ability to form physically, mentally, or socially. Again, it focuses on the lack of a normal ability that other people have and physically disabled people do not. The word restrictive that is used in the definition also communicates that it is a negative thing to be handicapped and should not be desired from individuals. It is easy to see that the words that may be used in casual conversations to refer to the disabled community have heavy histories and associated viewpoints. Continuing to use these terms only perpetuates the ideas and stereotypes associated and represents the disabled community in a different light. Considering that many people would like to stay away from these connotations, what other terminology exists? There are 2 different ways in which people can also refer to disability: identity-first language and person-first language. Here is an example of the difference between the terminology. Identity-first would be autistic person, versus person-first language would be person with autism. Although the same words are used in the naming convention, the order in which they appear is very important. In Canada, there is a unified attempt to make sure that anyone who has anything authoritative to say about disabled people does so in the language of person first. Person first language is usually advocated for because it focuses on personhood instead of disability. It allows for a person's identity and personality to be acknowledged before the disability is. Phrases such as, "I am not my disability," and "my disability does not define me," are associated with the stance of person-first language. However, this type of language is often criticized by many philosophers. As Tanya Tchaikovsky identifies in her work, "Disability arose by any other name," She argues that person-first phraseology conceives disability as a troublesome condition that is attached to people. It is not something that should be celebrated. Therefore, we should not attach it to people's identities. If it was something that is good, then why do we want to take it out of someone's identity? For example, if you were an artistic person, would you want people to see you that way? Saying that you are just a person with artistic qualities puts a negative connotation on being artistic. Furthermore, person-first phraseology assumes no social responsibility, and so it makes disability an individual matter. The lack of social responsibility of disability is a common struggle in the disability community. Using this type of language will only perpetuate the struggle and oppose the advocacy work being done. Shelley Tremaine also advocates for identity-first language. She agrees with Tchaikovsky insofar that the person-first language creates disability as something that you would want to separate yourself from. Essentially, there is something wrong with disability. Tremaine indicated that if you see the person, not the disability, then you are missing the full picture. Disabled people have unique experiences because they are disabled, not in spite of that. The term to her is dated and oppressive and serves as a legacy of ableism. Despite the criticism that exists, people do opt to use person-first language. For example, Leisha Carlson decides to use it in her work, which is something that we refer to heavily in this video. The World Health Organization, the United Nations, and the Canadian federal government also continue to use this phraseology. Now that we have identified the types of language that exist, it's time to discover what is the correct terminology for you to use. The short answer to this question is, there is no absolute right type of terminology to use. Each type of language has its associated pros and cons, which means it's up to your personal discretion what type of language is most appropriate for you. Although I would argue that using terms such as idiot, moron, cripple, and handicapped are unacceptable, if the context and history of these words is what you are trying to communicate, then it may be what you choose to use. The intent of this video is not to make you view the disabled community in a certain way, but expose you to the power, influence, and ideology that certain terminology has. There is an effort by the disabled community to reclaim some of these derogatory words. The word crip has been coined in a positive light to take over the use of the word cripple. This is a method to empower the disabled community by taking back the negative association with the word. A similar thing has been done in the LGBTQ+ community with the word queer. The best practice when it comes to terminology is asking the individuals that you are addressing what they would like to be called or how you should refer to their disability. This way you can avoid offending someone or making speculations about their identity and preferences. This may be uncomfortable for people to ask in social or professional settings, but it is still less uncomfortable for the person being asked than if you were to unintentionally offend them because of your choice of language. Remember that too. When you meet a person, you ask them what their name is. You don't just assume that they like to be called Patricia or George. The same practice and mindset should be used for disabilities. If you are still feeling a little unsure of how to use language around disability, or do you not have the ability to ask someone their preferred term, I would suggest trying to be as specific as possible. Disability as a category is very, very large. If you're talking about a specific struggle that a person in a community might face, it could be better to identify what people specifically face this struggle. If you are still struggling, you can guide yourself with these questions provided by Ruth Lackinson. Does this term incorporate current knowledge? And is it likely to incorporate future knowledge? Does this term contribute in a desired manner and content a portrayal of people with disability? Does this term name this and nothing else? Although there is no easy answer when it comes to terminology, being conscious of the impact your choice makes and thinking critically about the use of these terms will put you on the right path to making a positive effect and supporting your epistemic responsibility. That's all for me, folks. I hope this video made you think about the ways you talk about disability in your life. Reflecting on your use of language is so important, and I thank people for taking the step. Your uses of language has an impact not only in creating your self-image, but also in creating the image of the people around you. Thanks so much for watching.